welcome to this special edition of Redspin Sports. I know we say that a lot, but this one really is special, and it's been something that has been in the works for a while, and that is the interview, part one of what will be the interview, what is the interview with John Dolan, aka Gary Brecher, aka the War Nerd, Radio War Nerd fame, the Exiled fame, the host, really the star of the show, along with Mark Ames, and a program that for me personally has, brought me an immense amount of knowledge, just kind of escapist enjoyment, but also practical knowledge too, with regards to political movements, insurgencies, world of wars, and then tying it all, how it relates to us on a cultural level, social, political, identity level. And that's what we're going to hit on here in this discussion. Without further ado, enjoy part one of this Redspin Sports special of me, Nathaniel Wallace, aka Nate Wallace, with Professor John Dolan, aka Gary Brecher, the War Nerd himself. Enjoy. I've heard you and Mark both mention kind of like the Raiders affinity, and kind of like it's always struck me as someone just as a casual observer that when they would even come to town in Jacksonville, I mean, we got a team here that started playing in 1995. I was a 9-year-old boy, and it's the only major pro sports team. But the Raiders fans would come from anywhere. You have the costumes, you have Darth Vader, you have the guy with the shoulder pad spikes, and there's a class element, it seems to me, right, where if you feel alienated from your job, from your boss, from the society at large, whatever, that the Raiders, just like Al Davis and the way he feels about Pete Rozelle, it's sort of like it fits that kind of. I was just kind of curious what your experience was with, kind of like maybe being in academia and then kind of wanting maybe an escape from that perhaps, but just how you saw the Raiders and what that represented and that whole culture there in the Bay Area and maybe what it is now.
Right. Well, I'm old. That's the first thing to remember. Right. I was a Raider fan, although that doesn't even begin to express the intensity. But I was a Raider obsessive as a commuting undergraduate at UC Berkeley, most of all. I didn't know anybody. I didn't talk to anybody. The Raiders were like all I had. The Raiders and going to the military reference books. And so, I mean, for me, that most intense period of Raider fandom has to do with a lot of things. It definitely has to do with their pissed off and alienated pose in sharp contrast to the rest of the NFL, because the rest of the NFL in that era was weird. It was like the sort of Hunter Thompson era had never happened, especially teams like Dallas or Miami. In my head, that was related to them being from the South. I thought, they never went properly through the dissolving world of Berkeley and Oakland in the late 60s or early 70s. And that was connected for me with the Raiders. And at the same time, it was connected with a lot of things that are hard to express. Like, my family saw itself as a failure in a strange way. And my father was a very meek person. And the one time I saw him indulging in something like chatting with other guys was when he was an usher at Mass, and this was, I think, the Heidi game, and he was taking the collection plates around.
Tell the listeners what the Heidi game was for those who may be young, because I'm familiar with it, but. Was it Raiders Jets? I can't remember, but it was Raiders. It was a very close game. Yeah, and the Raiders were losing, and whoever was in charge at the network didn't realize that the Raiders were always losing until the 2-minute drill, and in that era, at least, that was when they won. So they cut away to some soppy film version of
the children's novel Heidi, and the Raiders then somehow, and it's been a long time, and I can't remember the details, the Raiders somehow took the game back and won. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the big cliffhanger wins in NFL history, and everybody was ecstatic. But very few people who weren't at the stadium got to see it. And that's one thing I should mention here. I was a TV Raider fan. I know someone now, Canon Dan, as he's called on the Radio Warner group, who was a stadium Raiders fan. He and his father used to go every week. I'm a TV Raiders fan. I never went to a Raiders game, and it never even occurred to me to go to a Raiders game. So anyway, the one time my father, seemed to be noticed by other guys, it was at Mass when he was bringing back the collection plate, and somebody took him aside and told him, "Oh, the Raiders won," and that made me weirdly proud, even though, of course, I wasn't going to let my father see that. But it was like there was a kind of solidarity there that was very, very rare in my world anyway.
Right.
I just expected us to be completely isolated from everyone else. And that combined with that feeling of outlawness, and it was very real in that era of the Raiders. They weren't nice people. I mean, probably a lot of other guys in the NFL weren't nice people either, but they had PR teams to make them look that way, and they had sports writers to lie for them.
Sure.
Whereas I remember Hunter Thompson did a great interview with some anonymous Raiders, and he published what it was like to watch them doing game footage, and it was amazing. He basically, my guess is he was talking to offensive linemen, because at that point I knew everybody on the team, and I could almost hear the quotes, and they were just saying, the first half is a bunch of bullshit. What we're doing is we're hitting those guys, we're beating them up, and that means that in the second half, we can roll over them, and all this, color analysis by NFL has-beens that you heard on the TV, it was very different after that. And that was part of the Raiders deal. Like the uniforms were black. Everybody knew Pete Rozelle hated Al Davis and hated the Raiders. One of their star receivers early in the game, although he was very early in the Raiders, was Warren Wells, who had to be bailed out, as the urban legend went, before each game.
Was he contemporaneous?
There was Ben Davidson who...
I'm sorry, I guess there's a lag, but was he contemporaneous with Biletnikoff, or was he even, or are they roughly the same age? Or I was just kind of curious the time frame.
Yeah, I'm not... Biletnikoff was also a pretty early Raider, but he lasted a long time. I saw a picture of him recently. I swear to God, he looks like Gary Oldman playing Dracula. And, but yeah, even Biletnikoff, he was this glue-handed wide receiver for the Raiders. Even he came into my life in a strange way. My brother, who was sort of more integrated with the real world than I was, said he went to this charity high school versus off-duty Raiders basketball game. And it was supposed to be a harmless thing, but he said Biletnikoff didn't like the way he was being guarded by one of the teachers. And he grabbed him by the throat and shoved him up against a wall.
Wow.
And I love that. I thought that was very Raiders.
Right. So how much of it connects to the idea of, if you feel like you described this sense of kind of alienation, I guess for so many kids in America, I think it's not unique, have that sort of relationship with parents for many reasons. Adults grow up feeling like they have to live up to these sort of standards. I mean, I always think back to The Graduate, and you think of like plastics, and you think of like certain people, people watch pop culture and they feel like they have to fit into things. And I feel like as a result, then they try to project things onto their kids, their own insecurities. And I think that it seems to me that with Raiders fans, a lot of times it's a chance to it's kind of it creates a community kind of there of people that have maybe had that shared. There's also it's more multinational if I'm not mistaken too. There's a much greater level of diversity when you look at, well, now they're in Las Vegas, but when they were in Oakland. But you also pointed out, I wanted to ask you about the difference between the stadium Raider fans versus the TV. And would you attribute that? I mean, I've read Pleasant Hell to being at that phase of your life where you just did not want to be around people maybe a little bit, or was it still kind of, even though the affinity for the Raiders, was it just, or being in crowds, was that something that was
no, I desperately wanted to I desperately wanted to be around people. It was people didn't want to be around me, as far as I could tell.
I see.
And but no, we didn't have any money, and the idea of going to it's strange. We were a strange family, kind of very confident in certain narrow ways involving language, and not confident in anything else. The idea of going to a Raiders stadium never ever crossed our minds. Whereas, Dan and his dad are at Raider games all the time, getting messed up and watching the fights and all that. And they talk. I mean, I've seen some footage of Raider fans fighting, and it's not like shoving matches like a lot of fake fights are. They are really scary people, some of them, and I think that's a point of pride too.
Yeah, absolutely.
But for us, we were. Now go.
Oh yeah, so I wanted to just jump real quick, and this is kind of maybe a diversion, but you mentioned your family and the fact that I'm from the South, and we were talking, and this is somewhat related to sports, but I want to get back to the Raider thing. But being from Jacksonville, Florida, being from the South, and ended up in Jersey City, I was kind of curious because I think you mentioned your family is from there, right? And then ended up moving out west, and I was just kind of I mentioned diversions earlier, but were you born in Jersey City, or were you born out west? And what was your, and if you don't, was your family, was it something that I guess just opportunity brought them from the east to the west? I guess, but just like so many other Americans, that common story of. I
don't know. We didn't talk about things in my family.
That's right.
I mean, we were very fluent on anything that wasn't serious, but as soon as a serious topic came up, it was a matter of silence. I was born in Denver, which is like halfway. My parents moved to Denver. I was born there, and then they kept moving west to California. I don't know why. My mother hated that. She felt like an exile from New York. My father, I think, because they were both poor, I suppose, but my mother would never admit that. My father did admit that. I mean, Clerk Street in Jersey City, I was back there a couple of years ago. Other places have gentrified, not Clerk Street.
It's moving that way, though, I can tell you.
Wow!
They won't believe it.
When Catherine and I went back to see. When Catherine and I went to see the old family place in Jersey City on Clerk Street, it was quite an experience, because what had been an Irish ghetto was now an African American ghetto.
Yes.
But the church was still central to the people there, because this woman saw us drive past the church, which was padlocked for I don't know why, but she said, go around the back. And we tried to go around the back, and that was padlocked too. And we're not good at talking to strangers, so we were both sort of shyly walking away. And she followed us at slow speed in her car and said, oh, that's your family's house over there. And it was just a vacant lot, because she mentioned that the house had burned down and a lot of kids had been killed in there. And then she talked about the church and people we might know from the church. So it seems like that church-centered world of shared poverty still exists in some form.
It does, and it's interesting because where you used to live, that's where I went up to visit Max Blumenthal, I guess, after about a couple months after I hosted him in Tallahassee. And it's funny you mentioned Fred Biletnikoff. Before I forget, he was, his name is everywhere in Tallahassee, Florida, because of his Florida State University alum status there, and they actually have the Biletnikoff Award. Winners are awarded every year there in Tallahassee. Kind of Justin Blackman, who was a 5th overall pick in the 2012 draft, and it's a wide receiver from Oklahoma State. Strange story. He won the Biletnikoff, made a lot of money, and then just disappeared off the face of the earth. And evidently, he just he had enjoyed drinking. Kind of, he got alienated from all the fan stuff. I think the fan stuff kind of the sense of just performing, and then maybe some mental health type stuff. And that's a lot of times people don't think about that. I know from being an athlete that the toll it takes on you, and people see you as like being in this kind of, you're supposed to be, because for a lot of people, they want to look at athletes and think of the perfected versions of themselves. Like, they have everything and a desire to live vicariously through that. And I think for some, especially the superstar players, that's a big reason why so many, I think, have the mental health issues they deal with. Especially a lot of times, ironically, it's the enforcer type players, whether in football, you think of, I don't know, Jack Tatum, I just, did a post life, but, guys like Dave Duerson from the Bears, Chicago, and then you had other hockey, NHL enforcers often have a lot of mental health issues. But it's just interesting, though, just that I'm bouncing around. But the Clerk Street thing, that's right around the corner, kind of from where Max lived in Jersey City on Jewett Avenue. But nonetheless, let's get back on track. One of the things I really wanted to ask you about was kind of when I was thinking about this, and to me, when I see Pete Rozelle, the former NFL commissioner, really built the NFL, elevated it to its current status of kind of being the hegemonic, dominant sports league in U.S. culture over Major League Baseball, which for the longest time was. I mean, you always often hear that football is America's passion, baseball is America's pastime, and I think that's kind of apt. But Rozelle, who would maybe what's a historical comparison? Yeah, I think of Madison Avenue when I think of him, and then when Al Davis, is he nouveau riche? I mean, he wasn't one of the wealthiest owners. Mark Davis still isn't. I know that Mark Davis got Sheldon Adelson money to go to Vegas and to build that new stadium. But in terms of just thinking of a historical analogy, maybe of Rozelle and Davis, I was wondering, just kind of in the repertoire you have of history, to me, Rozelle is like an archetype sort of corporate America, whereas Davis is like the aspirational guy trying to kind of fight his way in there and scrap and claw. I mean, is that fair? I mean, I'm just kind of wondering what you think.
Yeah. Rozelle was more like Kissinger. I mean, he was like the walking consensus, and I don't even know if that's real, but we're talking about how it seemed, and that was definitely how it seemed. And to me, this was mixed up with a lot of things. Like, there's a side of the Bay Area in that era which doesn't maybe it does still exist, but it was stronger then. Like, we're not like the rest of America. And Davis, although he was not from the Bay Area, well, who was? I wasn't either, really. But there was a shared identity that came around to the identity thing. We are Hunter Thompson's chosen home. We are, the people who are bad, but maybe not bad at heart. And I was an ultimate wimp, but, I still wanted to feel that way. And Davis, who looked like a 50s hood with a ducktail, greasy haircut and wearing shades all the time, and his motto, just win, baby. All that was in very sharp distinction to Rozelle, who was always dressed in ties. When you think of Davis, you think of him in a Black Raiders windbreaker and shades. Absolutely. On the practice field, sort of squinting and sneering. Totally different from Rozelle. And people like that too. I don't know if anybody knew how much money he had. I certainly didn't. I was kind of a dummy about money. I didn't understand money, and I still don't. But the teams were much more draft built, I think, in that era, and trades were rare. Like when they traded Ray Chester for Bubba Smith, I had deep forebodings because I loved the way Chester played. One thing about the Raiders, they had great tight ends before everybody else discovered
Casper, right?
Could be great. And Casper. And they've even developed this Waller out of, what seemed like journeyman status as far as I know. And suddenly he's
absolutely. Did you see the Hard Knock? Did you see the Hard Knocks a year ago, I guess, where they had the story of him and his alcoholism and him having to go to AA meetings, like kind of between practices and whatnot? It's really kind of
is that what happened? No,
with Waller,
I don't even qualify as a fan now.
No,
I'm just talking about memories from really long ago. Yeah. But anyway, all that fit together, and the Raiders were like the pirate. I mean, their logo was a pirate, and it's important for people who are younger than me, which is everybody in some mountain ranges, to realize pirates were not a big thing in that era. The only people doing the pirate thing were the Raiders.
Right. No, exactly. There were no Tampa Bay Buccaneers or anything of that nature. I mean, well, one thing I think it's interesting, and I'll just kind of hear what your reaction is to this based on what you said. It made me think is that, Davis was born to a Jewish family in Brockton, Massachusetts in 1929 or so. And I'm not sure, he was never one of the wealthiest type owners. But one thing that's different is he actually came from coaching. I can't imagine in this day and age to think of like an NFL owner with the amount of capital that requires to get to that level of stature. I mean, each one of these people, we're about to do a deep dive on who each of these 32 NFL owners are, to try to and do 4 each week for 8 weeks on these a weekly live stream we do, to really help illustrate the connections that the NFL has specifically to the larger U.S. ruling class and the project of U.S. imperialism, and how the financialization of the economy, neoliberalism. You could never have an Al Davis really emerge now. And even to this day, even as wealthy as Mark Davis is, he might be the only one who technically is not billionaire status. But his father, came from a coaching background. He was clearly a maverick. He was, so it wasn't fake. It wasn't contrived. Jerry Jones played college football, but then before I don't know if you've heard, but his net worth, he made just recently with the Texas winter storm, just made bank off of the devastation there, because the natural gas that he owns there and the supply they were able to jack the prices up because of demand, and it just truly, I think, of the embodiment of everything loathsome about capitalism is kind of there with Jerry Jones. But
what did he play? I've seen photos of him.
Sure.
So he doesn't look like he could play.
It doesn't. He was an offensive lineman for the 1964 Arkansas Razorback national championship team, along with Jimmy Johnson, the coach that he fired because he thought he was getting too much credit for Dallas's first 2 Super Bowls. I know this specifically because my ancestry going back to the Civil War is, at least in part, I'm not proud that whatever, it just is what it is. We can't control where we come from and whatever, but is on the Confederate side, and they had moved out to Arkansas when land opened up in the 1830s and 40s, and so I had my grandfather, who I was telling you about, who was a West Point class of 43 guy, 99 years old, and he was kind of just very goal driven. Their family, they grew up in the Depression. They were not wealthy or anything, but he was aspirational in the sense of wanting to be a Boy Scout, wanting to just kind of do everything possible to climb his way up and kind of reach that stature of being able to marry a Southern belle and kind of enter that world. And I have a lot of things I had to kind of work through to unwind all the kind of the propaganda and whatnot. And it's a love-hate relationship to this day. But nonetheless, he went to one of the few World War II veterans still remaining And but they were Arkansas rooted, and his brother was an academic coach actually for that team. He was also at LSU with Billy Cannon, who famously got in trouble for gambling on games and whatnot, and other kind of indiscretions. But is just a legend in the state of Louisiana up there, along with Huey Long. But in Arkansas, I mean, and it's interesting. I know you've talked about Portis a lot, and it's the same area of Arkansas that Portis is from and writes about, is where I used to go as a kid.
Wow.
At least 2 times every year. Places like Fordyce, Arkansas, where Bear Bryant is from, this great Alabama coach. And I look back, it's almost like I think it's like just 2 separate, a Jekyll and Hyde, not a Jekyll and Hyde in the sense of a good and bad self, but just separated selves, at least in terms of different that part of life. And having to really unpack a lot of that. I mean, I went back and listened to you and Mark in episode 47 of Radio Warner, and it really spoke to me, that experience y'all talking with I believe David Forbes about North Carolina and the Civil War in North Carolina. I mean, I started off college at the University of South Carolina, and it wasn't honestly until I had a class taught by Cleveland Sellers, who was program director of SNCC, and it was in 2008. And I was starting to become like unwind and realize, I mean, I wasn't some right winger or whatever. But at the same time, and this was also contemporaneous with me having the injuries I was having, realizing that a lot of the relationships, how transactional they were, and that the people that were there for me most of the time were Black teammates that were from, a different social class in the South, and realizing kind of just how ridiculously contrived this whole creation of, identity is, in terms of like, and really how the lost cause is central to that. And hearing you all talk about the lost cause, it just hit me like a freight train, because it was that narrative and the potency of it was so powerful. I mean, but thankfully my parents weren't pushing that on me, but my grandfather was my maternal grandfather, and he's has good aspects, and had had an amazing career and all that and whatnot, and he was loving and there and supportive. But I mean, it was also taking me to battle reenactments and Children of the Confederacy stuff as a child, and hearing all this just bogus stuff. And I sent you, I think, a message where, just even in the mail right now, we've had, here in Jacksonville. I mean, after I got hurt in college, I coached high school football, Robert E. Lee Generals.
Oh yeah, Robert E. Lee High School.
Yes.
Yeah, Robert E. Lee High School. I looked that up. It's amazing. So they were about to have a big meeting, and the school board, 5 people, I think, was going to decide whether to change the name. Have they decided yet?
Nope, it's still ongoing. They're sending mail out as we speak right now. But the thing that they're trying to, the people that want to save the name and all this kind of this rhetoric you're hearing is just it's just going on right now. The pushback is real. I'm proud of my cousin and a couple other activists I know, one of which Michael Sampson, who is the co-host of mine with this project, Redspin Sports. They had a big role in getting Nathan Bedford Forrest High School changed. And one thing I can go maybe grab, I'll show this to you. I was going to send you a picture. Just give me 1 second. I'll show you this. I think you might find this interesting. Let's see here. So this here is my brother's. I know people listening won't be able to see this, but that's generals in the front, and all the stars are for Lee and whatnot.
Yeah,
and they have a G for that. That usually it would be a star with an L inside of it, but for whatever the coach that year kind of didn't like that. And that rebel sticker there, that was, mind you, now when I was in high school, and this is my brother's high school helmet. The Nathan Bedford Forrest Rebels were an all African American team of Black kids running around the west side of Jacksonville, Florida, in poor neighborhood, dressed up with the Forrest Rebels, and that's that's history.
I mean, obviously, because you can sort of pass off Robert E. Lee as a gentleman who perhaps chose wrong, but was still a gentleman. But you really can't do that with Forrest. Right. I mean, Forrest was a slave trader. Forrest, at the very least, allowed the massacre at Fort Pillow and wrote a gloating letter about it afterwards.
Right.
There's no way you can justify naming any school after him at this point, especially one that's mainly producing African American graduates. That's crazy. I to the point that I wonder what were the arguments in favor of it.
Well, here's the history. All right, so Lee in Jacksonville, Florida, and I'm using Jacksonville as just an example. This is true of Montgomery, Alabama, so many other cities throughout the South. Before you go back to the 1920s, Jacksonville had two high schools, Andrew Jackson and Robert E. Lee. They were the white schools. There were also there were black high schools, and clearly they were extraordinarily underfunded. Matthew Gilbert High School is now a middle school that produced Bullet Bob Hayes, who's probably familiar with, or William M. Raines produced Harold Carmichael of the Eagles, and Brian Dawkins later, many others. But a lot of great talent has come out of this city. But nonetheless, there was, Lee. You're right. It's that lost cause narrative that has produced Lee in the minds of people as just sort of a sympathetic figure who didn't really he wanted to side with Virginia. And I heard you all in the episode talk about what that even really means, is like the idea that, this is a guy that went and committed, massacred people in Texas, fighting in the Mexican War, went to Harper's Ferry. And, obviously John Brown knew the implications of what they were doing. And, he obviously took what came as some sort of biblical prophecy, and it is what it is. I think it clearly, we all recognize now, that really was the Civil War already in action, just like Bleeding Kansas. But nonetheless, Lee has been turned into this godlike figure that somehow was just, he didn't like slavery. He was pained by it. His father, there's actually a tavern in Jersey City named after Light Horse Harry Lee, the Revolutionary War figure. So he comes from it's sort of this Sir Walter like Scott sort of literary, just fascination genre with losing. And the idea of losing, and the idea that there's this noble, and I heard you talk about tracing that back to Culloden in 1745, and the Scottish Highlanders being vanquished. Who was the poet, the great poet? I'm just blanking at the moment. Who kind of, was the founder kind of that genre of waxing romantically about losing, and really wrote all those poems in the aftermath of Culloden. Kind of a harbinger of Sir Walter Scott. I heard. Yeah,
his name was James McPherson.
And anyways, I think
he wrote the Ossian poems, which were faked Celtic epics, because what the Celts had retained, both in Scotland and Ireland, but more strongly in Ireland, simply because Ireland was much, much poorer, was a tradition of poems, often humorous and very sexy poems, involving St. Patrick having an argument with Celtic pre-Christian heroes. And McPherson saw that and realized, okay, I can sell my identity as a Highland Scot, which was sort of like being a Sioux or a Nez Perce after the Indian Wars. It was like, now that we are no longer dangerous to the larger population, we have become exotic, and people want to buy this. Specifically, lowland Scottish people wanted to buy the mystique of the Highland Scots. So he said, okay, but I can't sell this humorous, sexy stuff. That's not going to work at all. I need to make this a very wordy, tragic poem, and that meant defeat. And so he said the classic line of the Ossian poems is, they went forth to battle, but they always fell. And if you'd played that to any real Celt, they would have said, what the fuck are you talking about? Our poems are all like, we went forth to battle and we kicked their ass. I mean, there's my favorite pre-Christian Irish joke is the one about the warriors sitting by a campfire, and this new guy comes in, because, boy, you appreciate campfires after you've lived here a while. And he starts bullying them, and one of them says, oh, you wouldn't say that if my big brother was here. And the new guy says, oh, I imagine this almost in a Sam Kinison voice, like, oh. Well, he sticks his hand in the sack and pulls out a head and said, let's ask him.
Yeah, that's excellent. I appreciate the anecdote there. And to get me, if you don't mind, to get me back on that track I was just going on, because I really don't want to lose too much of the train of thought. Mentioning Arkansas and Jerry Jones and kind of like that whole network and the contrast to Davis. We'll come back to the Raiders stuff and close with that at the end. But I think now we're going on this narrative here with the connection between loss and the South. Let's kind of keep going with this into the college stuff, and then we'll kind of return, because I wanted to ask you about Hunter S. Thompson too at the end. And I think it'd be good to kind of bookmark the episode with that. But nonetheless, so what happened was essentially this Lee High School was made in the 20s, and so you couldn't make the argument that this is sort of what's happening rhetorically now, that it wasn't a reaction to Brown v. Board. I mean, you look at the Georgia state flag, which changed right after Brown v. Board to become 2/3 the Confederate battle flag. That was even flying over Atlanta in 1996. So don't even get me started the insanity of people like Rick Scott in Florida and Canadian politicians talking about moving the Olympics from China because of human rights. Meanwhile, we have the Confederate battle flag flying over the Georgia State House in Atlanta in 1996. I digress, but nonetheless, that needs to get thrown out there. The hypocrisy knows no bounds in this country. But Forest was going to be Valhalla High School, named after a new subdivision on the west side of Jacksonville. Jacksonville was strategic for the military. You had the Naval Air Station, Jacksonville, the home of the Blue Angels. You had Cecil Field Air Base. You had Mayport also. We had battleships. The Virginia senators had always, had a big, had a lot of power, so they were able to keep a lot of the fleet there in Virginia, which people argue, I guess, down here weakens the U.S. ability to potentially concentrate all the naval forces there at Virginia Beach, Newport News. But whatever, that's not my concern. So it all goes back to Forest, and Forest basically literally being named. Instead of it being named Valhalla High School, Brown v. Board happens, and suddenly that, his name is put on it. So it was a white high school then. It was pre-segregation and pre-integration. So it was not. So then what happened is white flight. You had we're not like up in New Jersey where every township or city or other places around the country would have their own school district. In the South, they're organized by county. So there was basically Duval County Public Schools. There were what they called the segregation academies developed all throughout the South. I mean, I had a girlfriend in high school I met at a camp who was from Selma, Alabama, and that town is still 100% segregated. They have it's a perfect example of how you can have a black political class but no real political power, because all the land is still owned by the white people. That it's been passed down for generations there. But you have a sheriff that is black, you have a mayor that's black, you have a city council that's black, but the business class, it kind of gets at what you and Mark have talked about interrogating corporate power and private capital and business power is much harder than government, even because there's walls of stuff. And I think that Cy Hirsch realized that, definitely, and said he never wanted to go back to it.
If we're talking about the Raiders of the mid 1970s, which was the era I was most intensely Raiders fan.
Sure.
Couple of things to remember. This was pre-internet. Getting news about the Raiders was very difficult. I mean, when I talk about this at all, it just proves what a sad life I had. And yeah, I think a lot of rabid sports fans, not all, but a lot, do have a pretty sad life. All I could do was go to the local sports talk station by pretending to borrow the old ex-cop car that we had to sit there by the side of the road somewhere and listen to Raiders news. And they were always talking about the Oakland A's or something. I didn't care about baseball. What did baseball have to do with anything? Baseball, I suppose, was not war. And the Raiders, were probably as close to war as you could get. War. And the other thing, so I'm just saying, being a fan then was very different. If you got 10 minutes of what you wanted to hear, that was amazing. Whereas now I could surf Raiders sites all day if I wanted to. It's very weird.
Right.
Right. But the other thing is, we always felt that one-on-one with fair refereeing, it was almost like a stab in the back theory that was always in the back of the mind of Raiders fans, that Rozelle hates us, and therefore the refs that Rozelle hires hates us. And whenever we could be on the proverbial level playing field, like when the Raiders played the Redskins in that Super Bowl and basically broke Joe Theismann's leg so badly that he could never walk again, it was like, it It was like, this is what would happen if it was fair.
Right.
But it's not fair because everybody's against us. And we've said on the show many times, all nationalism is wounded nationalism. Well, I don't know about other teams, but Raider fandom was always wounded fandom. And that was part of the,
Right.
we're the outsiders feel.
Yeah, absolutely. So no doubt. Now, you mentioned one thing before I forget is, Bubba Smith, that you mentioned the Raiders trading for. He was a central figure in kind of integrating college football too. We should note he was from Beaumont, Texas, and was part of that Duffy Doherty, they called the Underground Railroad to Michigan State when there were not Southern teams, predominantly white institutions, that is, that were taking black players. Michigan State did, and that sort of contributed to the pressure that was then put on the Southeastern Conference, which is now $1 billion industry in football, and others in the South having to ultimately integrate. He was a giant, literally a giant of a man. But I wanted to kind of trace going back. You mentioned Culloden, you mentioned McPherson. I think we talked Sir Walter Scott. Kind of, I guess, is that next group of that sort of romantic defeatist, I guess. I don't know. I'm just making something up, but nonetheless, I see like maybe a line between the modern Southeastern Conference football, where it's been integrated now from the ever since the early 70s. Archie Manning was really the end of all white Southern football. You look at Ole Miss, the Ole Miss Rebel teams, they had Colonel Rebel on the side of their helmet. They were all white. It became integrated in the early 70s. And then it became essentially a meat market, like in an arms race. The arms race is in the facilities. They're not paying players. We have this whole movement now of like not NCAA property. It's interesting. We can talk about that in a bit. But that's at the NCAA tournament. Players have the emerging consciousness of all the money that's being made, the lack of this last pandemic year, the surveillance they've been under daily, the pressure they've been made to feel for if you get COVID, then suddenly you're responsible for ruining your team's season and stuff. I think that we can't underestimate this. And we also have the Supreme Court ruling coming up in a week now in NCAA versus Alston on name, image, and likeness. So a lot of things in the works there. But you look back to integration. It led to instead of fighting the massive resistance of George Wallace, right? It's to me, it's like these white Southerners. I mean, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. Basically, I see a connection between the fans of a University of Alabama and Ole Miss, which was the hometown of William Faulkner. Absalom was a book that really spoke to my experience growing up at modernist fiction. But a guy like Thomas Supton, the nouveau riche type guy who comes and tries to carve out a world for himself, and by buying a bunch of slaves, and by sucking up to the planter class of the town, by having them over for wild, slave fights at the end. And while it's certainly not an exact parallel, and it's always dangerous when you kind of make these analogies to slavery, there's certainly the control over players, the idea that, okay, we've integrated, but the power structure, we bring these guys in, we build great facilities, we use this in recruiting. We're not going to pay them though, and we're going to the carrot we have dangling there is the chance to get to the NFL. Something you've been conditioned your whole life as being like the lottery ticket out. You hit the jackpot and having a body that would give you either had the speed, the size, the combination of all that to compete. And now you have, instead of empowerment amongst like that African American community to have control over themselves. I mean, I've just had a professor on, Dr. Derek White, who wrote about HBCU football and how they were essentially, when integration happened, they didn't want to just go away. They were intentionally, they would not, the PWIs would not play them. They wanted to make sure there was no chance of them competing, and they could cherry pick the best players. So now we have a system I really liken to a modern plantation system. You just cannot ignore the optics. It's very different than a Raiders game where it's multinational and it's the outcast. You go to an Alabama game and there are the rednecks, in the upper deck and all, but look at all the skyboxes. It's unbelievable. At Auburn University in East Alabama, look at all the skyboxes. University of Georgia, 45 minutes east of Atlanta, and yet you look on the field and it's 80% black. And it's like,
I would think there must.
People.
I would think there must have been a time, and you would know this better than me, when there were two clashing urges in the fan base for those college teams. And I know that college football is a big, huge thing in Southern American culture. So there would have been a time when Ole Miss would have had to say, on the one hand, we don't want an integrated team. We want to preserve an all-white team. But on the other hand, we're not going to be competitive if we do that. So, and those urges must have clashed.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting with it is a perfect example is the now senator from Alabama, Tommy Tuberville, the former coach from Auburn University and at Ole Miss. Before that, he was responsible for getting Ole Miss to stop the practice of bringing Confederate battle flags to the games in the 90s. But which is ironic given the fact that he ran a campaign that was almost explicitly racist as anything I've seen since the 1960s this last year. I mean, it was just absolutely insane, the rhetoric that was coming out of his campaign. And you think that he made his career off the backs of largely black players, that some of which have had great NFL careers, many of which are struggling right now with chronic pain, chronic, systemic generational poverty in the South. And then this guy goes on and sucks up the Trump and all, and just like kind of becomes this just buffoon. But the irony is he was the one, because of precisely what you said, that kind of put an end to that practice. But I was wondering what you think, because to me, wounded nationalism is sort of what I'm getting at, the thread I'm trying to get at here, if it seems confusing. And it's that the people in the South, and I'm wondering if you have a take on why this is, they really see themselves as the descendants of the Scottish Highlanders, the people who lost at Culloden. And I think it's a ridiculous parallel, because they weren't slave owners. The Highlanders, weren't running a plantation system. So where does this idea come from? These people that, buy it. How can you believe in lost cause ideology, but then also romanticize the Scottish struggle against, the crown in England? And that's something that I've struggled with my whole life to kind of make sense of and deal with. And it's this narrative too. And on that postcard I sent you about Robert E. Lee High School, something struck me about that. And I want to just read this quote real quick, and I think you'll appreciate this. It's the Duval County School Board has targeted Jacksonville's Robert E. Lee High School for a name change in their effort to erase historic names from all public schools. Well, I don't see that. No one's trying to change James Weldon Johnson. No one's trying to change Abraham Lincoln or High School, or no one's trying to change Martin Luther King Elementary School here. This narrative they have, you hear this from these people all the time. Where does that come from? It's to me, these are the embodiment. This is the modern personification of what you mentioned, what McPherson was writing about. This is a class of people who are not oppressed, that somehow think of themselves as victims. And I guess it ties in. That's quintessential, the grievance, stuff that, fascism's appealed to. It's not fascism, clearly, but I don't know. I mean, well, maybe it depends on how you define fascism.
I think you've already brought up one of the immediate causes of this in creating the whole weird state of mind of the Confederacy. And that's Walter Scott. I mean, in Huckleberry Finn, first of all, Twain Clemens hated Walter Scott and blamed him personally for starting the Civil War by filling the minds of the Southern elite with a lot of chivalrous nonsense. And to the point that, if you remember in Huckleberry Finn, there's a steamboat that's broken up and grounded in the middle of the river on a sandbar, and he names that ship the Walter Scott, because that's what he thought Scott's novels had done to the South. And it's hard to say Scott's novels' relationship to 1745, because it's all mixed up. There were some medieval novels. There were novels in the 18th century, but it's hard for Scott to deal with the Highlanders as they were, because they were very strange people, and nobody really wanted to hear that. For one thing, they were mostly Catholic, and nobody in Scott's audience wanted to hear that. They were also explicitly tribal people. I mean, they clan, if you like, but tribe is just as good a term. And I suppose I have read, I don't know if it's absolutely true, but that's where the KKK got the idea for calling itself a clan. But it doesn't have much to do with the Highlands.
Hey, so this is the end of part one. We cut it here to make sure that we can give you the best, most quality audio possible for the remainder of this discussion. We left it on this cliffhanger kind of intentionally, partly because the sound started to deteriorate a little bit more as it went on. But I think it's a good place to leave it here with the issue of the Scottish Highlanders and the connections to the American South and identity, and the Scots-Irish who came to the American South, and how all this connects back to sports, and everything from the Civil War to the Lost Cause, and how the Lost Cause informed 20th century college sport in the American South. We get into the large fan bases of the Southeastern Conference schools. And the connection between the present and the past. Then, of course, we're going to get back on the issue of the Oakland Raiders, the beloved Oakland Raiders of the War Nerd himself, and Mark Ames, too, and the official team of Radio War Nerd, who are now the Las Vegas Raiders, unfortunately. But I want to ask the War Nerd about the 1976 Super Bowl with John Madden and the Raiders, that victory. And we'll touch on and wrap up a few other things that were left unsettled from part one. But this was a fascinating discussion. I hope that the lag issues and any other technical audio stuff that may not have been ideal did not get in the way of the enjoyment and being able to hear this discussion, as it was one of the more enjoyable ones I can ever remember having, and especially as it relates to sports and making these connections. So with that said, this is the end of part one, and we hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to dropping part two as soon as possible. And when that happens, we look forward to hearing your responses, reactions, and comments. So until then, be well, and signing off for Redspin Sports.